On this episode of the show, I have with me Matt Lynch. He is CTO and co-founder at Sage, and we're going to be talking about tech, and specifically within the elderly care community. So we're going to ask him about the business problem, the scale of the problem, some of the technical issues that he has to deal with, from data capture to dealing with IoT devices and software, and end user adoption, some of the changes and change management that has to happen, and a few other things in there. Matt, thanks for taking the time.
Awesome. It's great to be here, Amir. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we start, can you tell everyone what you guys do at Sage?
Yeah, totally. So Sage is a platform for the improvement of quality of care and quality of life for older adults, mainly through providing better tools for caregivers. We operate mainly in long-term care communities as well as skilled nursing.
Absolutely. Love the space. This is going to be a good one. So this one, we are going to talk about the tech side, I guess, to kind of set the conversation. And maybe people aren't aware of how much tech exists within elderly care and the business problem itself. So you guys started Sage. We are one of the co-founders. What was the problem you guys set up? What was identified? What was the original intent of the company?
Yeah, definitely. So the three of us got together. So I have two partners, Raj and Ellen, on the business and product side. But we got together and bonded over the common problem of a complete lack of productization for like the elderly space. So the three of us all have personal stories related to like loved ones, family members, friends that have aged and have ended up in this system. And my personal stories of my grandparents, I just remember connecting with Raj during the pandemic when we were first kicking around building something here, and reflecting back on how undignified it can be as you're going through the different stages of aging in order to actually get the care that you need to continue like living your life, right? So my grandfather, good example of this, fell down, wasn't able to get help for a while, ended up in an assisted living facility, fell, and reflecting on his experience there, like the only real infrastructure that existed was a pull cord that he had in his bathroom. So he fell down. He would have had to crawl all the way across his apartment in order to get help. And then the way that help would arrive is like a little red light in the nurse's station would go off. Somebody may or may not be paying attention to it. And eventually someone would be able to show up, but no system for prioritization, no system for documentation. There was no data exhaust that we were able to actually like look at trends over time about how care was being provided to my grandfather. Raj and Ellen had similar experiences with their loved ones, Raj with his grandmother and her care, and Ellen with her dad. And all of those things together led us to like, there's a real problem here that we can solve. And the complete lack of infrastructure gave us confidence that we were going to be able to have an impact really quickly, right? So we got started building in March 2021 and shipped our first version of the product in July.
You know, I love mission-driven and mission-aligned, and it's ones that especially touch the founders, like in personal ways. You kind of shared that with us, and we'll circle back to the mission-driven aspect, obviously, because I'd like to learn a little bit more. But you know, in terms of, you know, you mentioned obviously in scale, right? So before I leave the business problem, scale. I'm assuming. I mean, we have not had to use elderly care facilities yet as a caveat. Hopefully maybe we'll avoid it, but I know a lot of people do, and I know there's lots of varying viewpoints, and many times it's not a positive viewpoint, I'd like to say. I think some people have, in terms of the scale, like when we're talking about scale and elderly care, how big of a problem are we looking at, and also where are we with average elderly care facilities and maturity curve on technology? Because I think those are two important pieces of the conversation.
Yeah. So definitely. So there's two pieces to that one. Like on the scale front, there are millions of people that are actively in long-term care communities or in that aging population. And there's a really interesting statistic that recently came out, where the baby boomers are aging into this population at a rate that we have never seen before as a society. And over the next 5 years, we expect to see a 40% increase in the population that is effectively those that we're serving with long-term care, while we're expected to see only a marginal gain or even just like flat traction with the number of caregivers that are available to provide that care. So there's going to be a huge mismatch in the humans that are aging into this population in relation to those that are going to actually be able to care for them. So without better tools, the quality is going to get worse, right? That's another point on this, which is, in long-term care, there's a wide spectrum of quality across. You have like very high quality, well-managed communities under some management, all the way down to like some very poor, bare bones, low quality ones as well. So across that spectrum, there's a bunch of different challenges to solve. It's
interesting. I'm hearing from some friends of the new facilities, and they sound really appealing. they sound like there's a modernization happening, but as you just described, I think it spans the gamut of where we're at now. From a technical perspective, there's obviously lots of data, right? Obviously, we're talking about people that are intimately observing, watching, patient care as well, right? And that maybe is where the conversation's more focused for this episode. And when we're thinking about that, and you're thinking about the challenges that you just articulated, where does the data go? Like, there's got to be a gap, I'm assuming, and if I'm wrong, let me know. But where does the data go from facility to actually something happening to it?
No, definitely. That's a great question. So the first point is like, what data, right? It's in most cases when Sage walks into these places, like there is a variety of different places that data is stored, but many times what we see is data related to the reactive care that a resident is receiving is just not present, or is of low enough quality and is ambiguous enough that it's not of any use longitudinally, right? So the traditional workflow here is in well-run communities, caregivers have the burden of either at the end of a shift or, hourly or over some period of time, they're responsible for going and asynchronously documenting the touch points that they've had with those residents in an electronic health record system, things like that. Many times what happens in those situations is these caregivers get busy, right? They're doing so many different things. They're caring for a ton of residents. They're being asked to do all kinds of other extraneous things while they're actively doing this. And many times they don't get an opportunity to do this documentation until like at the very end of their shift. And then when they do that, there are details that get lost. There's a lot of repetition that ends up happening. So the quality of the data asset is eroded to the point where you actually can't derive any insights from it. And what Sage does when we get in there is we provide a framework for residents to call for help, as well as caregivers to then triage and respond to those incidents, and at the point of care, do basic documentation to make it so that we're at least capturing basic information about response times, who was responding, what was the actual resolution for the nurse call alert, things like that. And they're being documented in the moment. And because of that synchronous documentation, we have a much higher quality and complete data set than we otherwise would have had in those communities if it was up to the caregiver to asynchronously document these things in an EHR. And then you're going back to your original question though, which is like, then once you have that, what do you do with it, right? It's like, how do you actually leverage that to do anything interesting? We're able to derive many interesting basic insights about the operations of these communities just based on those interactions that we're able to pull in, and see things like staff efficiency opportunities, as well as changes in resident behavior over time, right? So we'll be able to suss things out, like, is somebody slipping in an ADL skill? So ADL, activity of daily living, is an industry standard term. Effectively denotes how independent you are in one dimension of life. And we use these ADL skills as a means to, or ADL categories as a way to identify whether or not somebody actually needs a reassessment, whether or not somebody needs more attention than they otherwise would have had. And the way that this stuff happens traditionally is, biannually, something like that, you'll have a care assessment done and your care plan will be updated based on your level of independence here. But what we're able to do with this data is we're able to respond to these things in the moment, and we're able to actually look at these trends and proactively suggest care reassessments, things like that, to make sure that people are getting the attention that they need as these things start to change.
I guess, as you kind of outline, I mean, obviously we can kind of all envision this, right? Even if we've been to the doctor's offices, different facilities where there is that delay, right? That I have all of us work to do. I can't stop to do the data capture. I'm going to do it at the end. It's going to be based on recollection. Some are really good at it. Some are not good at it. I probably forget 99% of everything that had happened during the day, but that's me. When we're looking at this data capture issue, I mean, you see in doctors' offices, we have somebody who's following, literally a doctor around, just taking notes on a laptop. You see some electronic devices. And you mentioned there's a mix of technical solutions that you guys work with. Is there, is the cost of bringing these solutions to facilities, and obviously some of them might be more profitable, less profitable, are we hitting a point where it should become more mainstream and it's a matter of education adoption, or is the cost of technology, especially in the settings that we're talking about, is it still high enough where you're like, you know what, I can't fault them for not implementing some of the newer tech?
That's a fantastic question. And I actually think that the incumbent solutions, so technology that we're seeing in a lot of these communities that are still being maintained, actually carries a cost burden somewhere on the order of like 10 times more expensive than modern technology is. I will say, though, that there's a change in thinking when you're applying this new technology. And a lot of these places have had vendors come in and say, like, we have the next amazing system. And really what they get is like variations on a theme from an old one. There's a bunch of like hidden costs on the hardware side. There's maintenance problems. They're not actually getting value out of the product, so they're not actually able to derive operating income or operational efficiency from the product that's deployed. But the leaps in technology over the last 10 or 20 years are amazing. And that's what we set out to do when we got started. Is the first opportunity we saw was, we can just apply modern technology to this problem space. We can provide that technology at 1/10 of the cost of what these incumbent systems are. And we're able to provide them something that actually produces value beyond just this reactive nurse call thing that doesn't have any sort of longitudinal data output. And another interesting thing on top of that is, over the last few years, we've seen the evolution of Gen AI, which only commoditizes this further. Like, the capabilities that Gen AI has unlocked for this industry are just enormous, and we're only scratching the surface on what's going to be possible there. And it's all at a cost that's a fraction of what they were otherwise paying for these systems.
Very interesting. I guess maybe we'll come back to the tech in a second, but I am curious, as you've kind of been talking about bringing some of the tech so that it's at a lower cost. You mentioned a 10th of the cost. Obviously, there's a hardware and a software component to a lot of these different products. When it does come to the actual adoption, right? And I think there's almost two sides to this. One is organizationally adopting it and making sure that works, your staff uses it, but also adopting it from your perspective, adoption, because you need people to start using it so that obviously larger pieces of the ecosystem fit in. I might not know all those pieces, but I am kind of curious from adoption, from both you guys getting adoption and then people in the actual facilities adopting and how that plays out.
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the interesting things about the first touch point, like the operational touch point that folks have with Sage, is that it's a life safety system in these communities, so nurse call. And residents are the ones initiating the call to action. So residents are creating a record for everyone to see forever that says, I'm calling for help right now, right? And then the accountability of responding to and documenting what's actually happened when the resident called for help falls on the caregiver. So this is a workflow that they had been performing before, but we've been able to replace like the outdated hardware that these communities are using to actually perform that nurse call functionality with workflow software that allows us to record these touch points. And it's being initiated by residents when they're calling for help. So that drives the initial adoption. Caregivers effectively have to use our software because that's how they get credit for responding to these nurse call alerts, right? And then what we see is that data that we're able to put together, we're able to synthesize in a way where we're able to provide insight to community management, regional management, owners, operators that they otherwise wouldn't have had into their operation, such that they can actually see opportunities for increased efficiency, opportunities for intervening in a resident's care, and things like that. And as they start to see the value there, we start to see them engage with at least our teams in the data that we're producing. But when it comes to actual like product adoption and product engagement, we're seeing that mostly with the on the ground teams who are specifically at the point of care with the residents. So doing that care logging, alert triage, things like that. Does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, I think that's an important part of the equation because I feel like having this tech and trying to modernize, but then people not filling in the gaps. I mean, that's hard. And again, going back to the scenario of someone working in an elderly care facility, a lot of times you are probably being very reactive. There are problems 24/7. I don't do the job, but I can only imagine somebody's not sitting for long before they're off to do the next thing. So I kind of view when we don't see tech being used, is it because people don't have accessibility? People don't have the ability to actually adopt because there's so many different things that they just can't fit in their day. It sounds like in this case, making it accessible and training, because it does give them some of the credit you mentioned, is actually a very easy lead into adoption.
Yeah, that's right. And you reminded me of an important second aspect to this, which is another huge driver of not just adoption, but satisfaction of the product, which is in these traditional nurse call scenarios, because there's always typically just qualitative evidence around the response to a particular resident's needs, conversations with a family can be quite difficult in those situations, right? Where it's like, the resident in the community is having a really tough time. They're at one of the toughest moments in their lives, and they're rightfully, not feeling great about it. And we see scenarios where family comes in and they say, you're not taking care of mom. Mom is having a really tough time. We need you to fix it. And a lot of times what ends up happening there is it's a he said, she said situation where the caregiver says like, no, I am doing this stuff, but the family is the one who's effectively paying the rent. And because there's no quantitative evidence of engagement with the resident or documentation around what was actually going on, the family's going to win in that scenario, which can be really tough on the caregiver. And the statistic in this industry blew me away when I learned it, which is on average, there's 80% caregiver turnover year over year in this industry. So 4 out of 5 caregivers will churn within a year at these communities because they can be such a tough environment to work in. But one of the things that we've seen with the introduction of Sage is we're actually able to give caregivers credit for the work that they're doing, and we're able to arm them with quantitative data around the situations in which they're responding to with these residents, which completely changes the dynamics when having these discussions with family, right? It goes from the communities on the defensive, saying like, we're actually doing what we're supposed to do here, but the family is arguing because there's no data, to here's exactly what's going on with your mom, and these are all of the touch points we've had with her and what actually happened over the last month, which it completely changes the tone of the conversation, right? To more collaborative, like, okay, cool. So how can we support you in caring for mom? Like that kind of thing. And because of that, we've actually seen meaningful reductions in turnover in these communities, and caregivers like using Sage because they know that when they use it, they're going to be seen and that they're going to get credit for the work that they're doing.
I mean, honestly, that's really interesting and fantastic, because as you kind of mentioned the turnover, that sounds crushing for the facility and the patients, right? Like, especially if you have long-term care patients, they're going to be seeing new people constantly come through, and that's a lot of their interaction. Like that's some of their outlet. I'm going to ask you a left field question. I could probably ask you about elderly care for a while because it's an interesting topic, but I am starting to ask founders this question because from a perspective of a founder, I do think it's interesting. You obviously have found a very mission-driven business problem to solve. I don't know, from your background, how much depth you had, obviously, aside from your personal experience within the field. And as a founder, I mean, you did find a business model that's obviously scaling now. If you were to look back on the early days of Sage, was the business from day one to today, has it changed much? Was it obviously the mission probably seems like it was very much intact, but the business itself, how much transformation, or was there any pivoting, or is there any evolution, or has it been pretty consistent?
It's a great question. And you're right. Thematically, the business is pretty similar to the way that it was when we got started. I will say that when we got started, we wanted to rebuild all aspects of the vertical, right? So you have the widget that the resident's going to be interacting with. So we wanted to revolutionize that. There was the workflow that the caregivers were going to be interacting with to do the documentation. There was the data exhaust, which was like, wouldn't it be a neat problem to have enough data that we can actually do analysis and provide these insights to folks? So when we first got started, it was, how do we build a system that is data oriented so that we can actually capture all of that data exhaust? And then how do we build a better mousetrap? So we did spend a bunch of time exploring various hardware mediums to provide to residents to call for help. But at the end of the day, what we discovered, which is probably like one of the biggest learnings that we had in our early days, is that residents mostly do not care what the interface that they're using to call for help is. Really what they want is something super, super simple that when they need help, they just get it right away, right? So figuring out how to pivot from making it the resident's responsibility to, figure out how to better prioritize the care that they're asking for, and focusing more on the workflow component that we're providing for the caregivers. So while we did think about the whole ecosystem in the beginning, we did not have such a strong focus on that like workflow software component, as also trying to improve the hardware component for residents. But what we found is like really the button was good enough in almost every scenario, and that the highest value that we were going to be able to bring is on focusing just on that workflow component and getting the data out.
I love that. And the reason I'm asking is I get asked by founders sometimes about, if somebody does talk about they pivoted, I do get a lot of conversation around, pivoting versus keeping the vision versus knowing what the North Star is, all those dynamics. And I think somebody mentioned that, it's really hard when you're driving at a very hard pace to actually know if you're driving in the right direction until you get that visibility. And sometimes
totally
it's too late. So I think in your case, you guys are very mission driven, and that's aligned.
I will say, like, there's one philosophical thing that we all, like Raj Allen and I, were aligned on in the beginning, which is we can't take a year to build the first version of this, right? It's like it's very much incremental testing. It's very much get in there and embed with the users, understand exactly what they want. So while we did start out with this thesis of like, we have to revolutionize hardware, we have to revolutionize the software, we have to figure out the data, we shipped super fast. And the way that we actually arrived at the button was, we need a way to test this software while we're thinking about doing this hardware development. So is there something that we can get that's going to allow us to short circuit that hardware development to get out there and actually do the testing? And what we found is like, we got very strong adoption just from having the button and the workflow software when we deployed it, right? So it allowed us to gather data really quickly and figure out that like, this is a thread worth pulling, and maybe we can do that stuff on the side, or maybe we do it in parallel. Eventually got to the point where it was like, we don't need it. But basically being able to validate the concept super fast and make it so that we don't spend a ton of time investing to the point where we have to pull the plug on something that we spent a bunch of time and money on.
Absolutely. Matt, this is fantastic. I love the topic. I love it when it's mission driven as well. I guess if somebody wants to ask you a follow-up question, wants to learn more, what's a good way of connecting with you?
Totally. Yeah. Just connect with me on LinkedIn. Typically pretty responsive with messages there. So, feel free to get in touch.
Absolutely. Matt, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on and thanks for sharing.
Awesome. Yeah. Happy to.
Absolutely. All right. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, this was a great mission-driven episode. Matt walked us through how the idea was born, some of the business problems around elderly care, how technology is shifting the needle. We even talked a little bit about adoption and really some of the challenges around making sure you get a stickier, caregiver and impacts benefits to the whole ecosystem. And I think it was a great episode. I love it when we get a mission-driven one. So please share this episode with others that might enjoy it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.